Test. 1, 2, 3. Test. Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Well, good evening. Welcome to our study of trusting God even when life hurts. It's a classic book by Jerry Bridges, author also of another classic, Pursuit of Holiness, that Mark Sweat, who's over here, has taught here at the church before. Many people read that in the 20th century. This was a little lesser-known title, but I think it fits the circumstances we find ourselves in 2020 amidst this pandemic and the turmoil in our nation. The challenge for us is to keep trusting God when things are difficult. And many of you have been through individual circumstances that have been difficult to bear. And tonight I'm going to interview someone on that theme. We'll be doing it each week, interviewing someone from our church family after the teaching time, which will roughly be 20 minutes or so. At least that's what I'm guessing. We'll just work through the contents of an individual chapter, so some may be longer and some shorter. But at the end of that, each week we will interview someone from the church family. Tonight it's Mike and Pam Lunsford to talk about how they have been challenged in life to trust God even when their life has been difficult, when they've had adversity, and so we'll look forward to that. So if you're watching this on a recording, you want to fast forward to the interview, just fast forward to the end of me sitting here in this chair with this TV, and you'll see Mike and Pam and I on the chairs during the interview portion. But if you're watching us live, well then, thank you for joining us, and for those of you here in the room, thank you also for joining us. I'm going to lead us in prayer, and then we'll talk about Is God in Control? Chapter 2 in this book, Trusting God. Let's pray together. Father, open our hearts to the truths that you would teach us this night through your servant, Jerry Bridges. We thank you for how well he knows the Scriptures and how well he takes and captures these doctrines and packages them in bite-sized pieces in these chapters that we could read and understand how better to trust in you through the challenges of life. And so I pray that even this night you'd bless our understanding of who you are and of your providence in our lives and the fact that you are completely trustworthy. Lord, help us to have understanding, and I pray that we'd also walk in obedience to you as our King and Lord. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, the chapter title is God in Control? And Dr. Bridges begins by writing about a best-selling book a long time ago in the 20th century by a rabbi who became rather famous through this book. His book was When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and the rabbi was Rabbi Harold Kushner. And in that book, he wrote about there's a copy of the book there. He wrote about Job, and about Job, here's what he said. Job was forced to choose between a good God who is not totally powerful or a powerful God who is not totally good. And he's saying Job chooses to believe in God's creation, God's goodness. Now, I would urge you to go back and read the final chapter of Job. He comes to a far different conclusion than I did when I preached through Job in, I believe that was 2019. So I encourage you to read the text for yourself and not take Rabbi Kushner's word for it. But in his view of teaching of Job, he says God wants the righteous to live peaceful, happy lives, but sometimes even he can't bring that about. It is too difficult even for God to keep cruelty and chaos from claiming their innocent victims. So he has this image of God that he portrays in his writings that is a kindly enough God, but he's an impotent God. The problem with Rabbi Kushner's conclusions in his book is that he denies God the sovereign control that God himself in the Holy Scriptures claims. The implicit assumption he puts forth in his book is that if God is both powerful and good, why is there so much suffering, so much pain, so much heartache in the world? Indeed, if there is suffering in this world, then it must be attributable to this problem, this dilemma. He words it this way, that God, next slide please, God is so controlled, is there one before that? Okay, well, let me say it this way off the screen, off the book then. God is either good and not all powerful, or he is powerful and not all good. You can't have both, is the argument. Maybe you've heard that before. It's been made by many in a lot of different writings, and that's essentially what Rabbi Kushner's saying way back in this book from the 1980s. So we want to talk about, though, the providence of God. The providence of God is what we want to talk about that addresses the question that's being raised by Rabbi Kushner. Because the Bible teaches we can have it both ways, that God is both sovereign, that is all-powerful, and he is good. And so we categorize that teaching under the providence of God. We'll talk next week about sovereignty of God, and there's a bit of an overlap there, so we'll deal with that next week. But tonight, I want to talk primarily about God's providence. And it's a term that we use to speak to God's seeming intervention in our affairs. For example, when people would ask me why or how Tina and I ended up in Lake Wales, Florida, my answer would be, well, by the providence of God. That's a short answer. It's also a theologically correct answer. There is a longer answer, but there's a lot of details in that, so I won't bore you with that tonight. But we see this as the providence of God, that God brought us here 13 years ago. And so when we speak about the providence of God, we're saying this, that God so controlled or arranged circumstances of my life that a specific result occurred. So I gave you my example of that. We ended up here in Florida. And so when you're speaking of the providence of God, that's usually what you're saying. Now, there are two things wrong when we begin to speak about the providence of God, or two errors we tend to make when we speak about the providence of God. One is that we only use it in connection with seemingly good events. You don't hear people typically say, I was in a car wreck and paralyzed from the waist down by the providence of God. You don't hear that, do you? No, you hear it attributable to good events that happened, circumstances that allowed you to meet the spouse of your dreams. And now you've been married 54 years, and you think back to how God brought you together, and the providence of God, we were brought together so many years ago, etc. So we usually speak about the providence of God only in relation to good events that happen in our lives. The second error we make when we speak about the providence of God that Bridges points out is that we imply, probably unknowingly, but we imply that, well, God intervenes at these specific points and times in our lives. We say, well, God did this. This happened by the providence of God, and we'll cite an example here or there. When in reality, you and I are living our whole lives under the providence of God, right? And so maybe we don't mean to imply that we're not living under the providence of God all of our lives, but sometimes the way we speak about His providence, it seems to indicate that. When we speak about the providence of God, the church has, throughout history, believed we're speaking there of His care and His governance over all His creation at all times. Very comprehensive view. Well-known theologian J.I. Packer, who just recently went to be with the Lord, wrote an incredible book on knowing God. He defines providence in this way. This is a bit of a dense definition, but worthwhile. He calls it, the providence of God is the unceasing activity of the Creator, whereby, in overflowing bounty and goodwill, He upholds His creatures in ordered existence, guides and governs all events, circumstances, and free acts of angels and men, and directs everything to its appointed goal for His glory. Now, there's a lot in there, and we can unpackage it, but rather than do that, I'm going to show you Jerry Bridges' much simpler definition of providence. He takes elements out of Packer's, I think, even some of the very same words, but he condenses it significantly, removing some concepts out. And his definition then is this, that God's providence is His constant care for and His absolute rule over all His creation for His own glory and the good of His people. Now, a number of things you see there. Notice the comprehensive nature of His care. It is constant. And of His rule, it is absolute. And the scope for over whom He cares, Packer referred to angels and people. He just summarizes that by saying over all His creation, visible and invisible, you could say. But He does this to what end? For His glory and our good. His glory and the good of His people. God never pursues His glory at the expense of the good of His people, nor does He ever seek our good at the expense of His glory. The two are held together, inextricably bound together. And so last week we saw in chapter 1, Bridges asks the question, can you trust God? It's a personal question. Can you personally trust God? But also, to emphasize the word trust, can you trust God? Is He trustworthy? And so what we say when we believe in the providence of God is we're saying, yes, He is. He is trustworthy. You can trust Him. The doctrine of God's providence clearly affirms that we can trust God. We can trust His sustaining action and how He upholds and perseveres all His creation. So let's talk about that first. God sustains, how God sustains. The Bible teaches that God not only created the universe, but He upholds and sustains it day by day, hour by hour, even moment by moment. Scriptures say this, the sun's the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of His being. sustaining all things. How? By his powerful word. Or Colossians 1:17, you may be familiar with it. Speaking of Christ, it says he's before all things, and in him, in Christ Jesus, all things hold together. He sustains this world. Nothing exists of its own inherent power of being. Nothing in all creation stands or acts independently of the Lord's will. The so-called laws of nature are nothing more than the physical expression of the steady will of Christ Jesus our Lord. So the stars, for example, continue in their courses, he writes, because God keeps them there. We know that. Isaiah 40:26 says, lift up your eyes and look at the heavens. Who created all these? Who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name? Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. So God sustains his creation. Also, we read of this in Nehemiah 9:6. You alone are the Lord. You made the heavens, even the highest heavens, and all their starry hosts, the earth, and all that's on it, and the seas, and all that is in them. That's quite comprehensive, isn't it? You give life to everything, and the multitudes of heaven worship you. Furthermore, the psalmist in Psalm 147 affirms that God cares for creation and sustains it. In Psalm 147, 8 and 9, he covers the sky with clouds, supplies the earth with rain, and makes the grass grow on the hills. He provides food for the cattle and for the young ravens when they call. So not only the inanimate objects of our universe, like stars, but also all men, all animals are sustained by God. He didn't simply create us and walk away. He constantly sustains that which he created. In fact, in Acts 17, you may be familiar with Paul speaking there to the Athenians, and he says, speaking of the Lord, that he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. That covers it all, doesn't it? From one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out the appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. Furthermore, God did this so that they would seek him, that all people on the earth would seek him, perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Indeed, we take our breaths by the power of God. He supplies our daily food. 2 Corinthians 9:10 tells us our time is in his hands. Psalm 31:15 tells us every breath we breathe, 2,000 of them, or 20,000 of them, 2,000 would be much, 20,000 of them a day or more. Every breath is a gift of God. Every bite of food we eat is a gift of God. Every day we live is determined by God. He constantly sustains us and cares for us. I tend to think of God sustaining us and how he works in our lives. I remember Packer, speaking of Packer, I remember the illustration he told of Grand Central Station, or it may have been a train station in England, his native land. Lived most of his latter years in Vancouver, but grew up in England, and so I think it was speaking of a train station there, but I'm going to say Grand Central Station. You get the idea. And he wrote in his book, Knowing God, his classic book, he wrote of this illustration of the train station where you see trains going in and out, and all these different tracks, and there's lights, and there's clocks, and there's so much running this way and that, and it seems a bit chaotic if you're down there on the platform and trains going here and there and from one location to another, and it can be a bit bewildering. But then he spoke of the director of the train station who's up in a tower above it all. And that one in the tower sees all the comings and goings, has it all charted out, has a map there, knows what's going and knows which train is on which track and where it's come from and where it's going. And there's not a train that does this origin or destination that that director of the train station does not know about. And so it is with the sovereignty of God. We're on the platform. We don't have the vantage point of being in the crow's nest, so to speak, and seeing the perspective of how it all is working together in an organized way. Rather, for us on the ground, it can seem kind of chaotic at times. But we must believe that God is a God who sustains and organizes all this earth, again, for our good and his glory. If we're to trust God, we must learn to see that he is continuously at work in every aspect and in every moment of our lives. But not only does God sustain, the scriptures are plain, God also governs. He governs all his creation. He governs this universe, the inanimate creation, as well as all the actions of all the creatures. He's called the ruler of all things. In 1 Chronicles 29:12, also we read of his rulership in the next slide here. 1 Timothy 6:15, which God will bring about in his own time. God, the blessed and only ruler, the King of kings and the Lord of lords. In Lamentations, we find Jeremiah asking, who can speak and have it happen if the Lord has not decreed it? Or in Daniel 4:35, there's a lot in Daniel about the sovereignty of God and the providence of God. Daniel 4:35 says he does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? We can't question God as if God doesn't know what he's doing, Daniel says. And also in Daniel 4:17, the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and gives them all to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. So God raises up kingdoms and brings them down. It determines the rulers over the nations of men. So his point is, no one can act outside of God's sovereign will or against it. Augustine, the great patriarch church father, said this, nothing therefore happens unless the omnipotent, it's a reference to God and his power, all-powerful, unless the all-powerful God wills it to happen. He either permits it to happen or he brings it about himself. In other words, there's direct or indirect causation, if you want to think of it in those terms. And so, whatever. So from a spider in the corner of the room to Napoleon marching across Europe, all these are under God's control. God's rule is invincible, and it's also incomprehensible. We read of that in Isaiah. Isaiah writes this, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So God told Isaiah about the scope of his thinking, his thoughts, far more elevated beyond that which Isaiah himself could even comprehend. And Paul, in this great exclamation in Romans chapter 11, says this, oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. So we see, as Bridges emphasizes, God sustains and God governs. Thus we can say, yes, God is in control of our universe, of our world today. Unfortunately, because God does not act as we might think he should, sometimes we conclude he cannot act as we think he should or would. In other words, I think of the example that comes to my mind. I think of something horrible, a really horrible incident I remember reading of was when Stephen Curtis Chapman's son, teenage son, learning to drive, backed out a vehicle out of their driveway. And Stephen Curtis Chapman's a Christian singer of some repute a number of years ago now. But his son, a teenage son, imagine the horror of this, backs out of the driveway and had a younger sibling in the driveway, backed over that child and killed the child. Now, can you imagine a worse tragedy than that? Now you have the death of this child, maybe a toddler. I don't know the age of the child off the top of my head, but obviously grade school child or toddler. And you have that loss to deal with, your own grief. Then you have the grief and the accompanying guilt of that teenage child who's got to be horrified by that experience and will live with that the rest of their lives. You look at a circumstance like that and you think, well, God should act. And if you see that God didn't act, then it's easy for us to conclude, well, he couldn't act. You follow me? If we think God should act and God doesn't act, then we conclude often God can't act. That's where Rabbi Kushner's and others would say, well, see, look at all this suffering. Surely there can't be a God who has power. He's powerless to stop this. Surely he must be, otherwise he would do something. And so you come down, though, the problem with that conclusion is you come down to saying, well, if God is not in control, then is it chance? Is it God or chance that governs our universe? That's essentially kind of the choices there. If you believe that God sustains and he governs the universe, bringing all things to their appointed end, you believe in the providence of God. However, many people question that. Even church-going people may question that. But if you don't believe in God's sovereignty over all things, his providence in all things, then you're left with kind of believing in chance, something like that, or fate, you might say, or randomness, something like that. In Rabbi Kushner's book, here's what he wrote. Can you accept the idea that some things happen for no reason, that there is randomness in the universe? And he gives the example of a forest fire, which way the wind blows. And so he struggles to understand how God can have providence over all things. And so you're left with one of the options becomes, if you don't believe in the providence of God, is you could become like a deist. Deists were particularly popular as a I don't know, philosophical way of thought. It's quasi-theological as well. But this concept that there is a God who created the universe and then he walked away. Kind of the watchmaker wound up the watch, wound up the clock, and then the clockmaker walked away. And he lets it now run of its own accord, according to the natural laws that he put in place and man's devices. That's deism. And some of our founding fathers are thought to be deistic. Ben Franklin, Jefferson to some degree, and even Adams, John Adams. Some even contend Washington was a deist. But it's not as in vogue as it used to be. More what's in vogue now theologically has been somewhat of a similar, maybe a cousin of that thought, is open theism, which teaches that God acts, his acts are conditioned by our choices. It's a strong emphasis on the free will of man. And it actually goes as far as to assert that God does not know the future, because the future, how God acts, is determined in response to how we act. So if you can imagine that, it's actually somewhat human determinism, because we influence what God does. Now, many people are practical deists or open theists. Maybe they don't know it. They wouldn't assume those labels for themselves. But the way they relate to and understand God's actions in the world make them fall in that category of deist or an open theist. But if you believe that God is sovereign and his providence is extended to all affairs, we believe that God chooses at times to not exercise his sovereignty in the affairs of man, that he chooses to, let me just read it. He writes, "Many accept the concept that God is sovereign, but believe that he chooses not to exercise his sovereignty in the daily affairs of man." So, thus, Bridges argues, those people are practical deists. Now, what counters that thought for us biblically? Well, here it is. A very familiar passage to us from Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 10, verse 29 and following. Jesus said, "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And even the very hairs of your head are all numbered. So don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows." Point being what? That Jesus has such detailed care for his creation, down to the sparrow that is virtually, financially speaking, worthless, and yet he cares for them. And what is his point? Well, his point is if God exercises sovereignty and care for sparrows, most certainly he will do that for his own children, right? God doesn't walk away and leave us at the mercy of uncontrolled random or chance events. He gives this illustration. I'll just read you Bridges' illustration at this point. He writes, "A Christian husband flew in a private plane to another city to give his testimony at an evangelistic meeting, taking his son with him. On the way home, they ran into an electrical storm that caused the plane to crash. Both the father and the son were killed. A Christian friend, in an effort to comfort the bereaved wife and mother, said, 'One thing you can be sure of, God has no part in that accident.'" Now, I understand that's not the time when pastorally you're going to want to say God's sovereign over that, or wow, look at the providence of God. Now, it'd be horrible. That'd be pastoral malpractice to do that. You would never do that. But it's interesting that in these times of hardship and suffering and loss, that you sometimes say things that really do not square with the scriptures themselves. Essentially, as Bridges points out, a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without our Father's will, but apparently a plane with Christians aboard can. That would be the conclusion you're making, or that person who made that statement was making. A lot of Christians are unwilling to accept the fact God is working because we don't understand how he is working. And we've chosen to substitute the doctrine of chance for the doctrine of providence. Now, another thought you might have, well, is it maybe a chance? Maybe God's not totally in control. Maybe he isn't governing and sustaining our universe, that really that it is chance. Another way we malign the nature of God is to say that he's good, but he's not sovereign. I share with you at the beginning how Rabbi Kushner said that. Another author said it this way. She spoke of her pain as being utterly frustrating to God, and she gave thanks to God for being her devoted, caring, frustrated Heavenly Father. You see, faced with the dilemma of how a loving, sovereign Father could allow her to experience agonizing pain, she found relief in the belief that God was indeed frustrated about her pain, shedding tears with her, even as a mother may weep at the suffering of her child. The problem with that is the scriptures are pretty plain that God is never frustrated. It's written this way in Daniel chapter 4, verse 35. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? We looked at that verse earlier. We see this in Job. And also it's reality that, our lives are indeed the battleground for invisible forces, God himself at work and also Satan. But we also understand from the book of Job that Satan only did what he did in the life of Job by permission. Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on himself do not lay a finger. He set the boundaries for Satan's activity. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, he's in your hands, but you must spare his life. He set the boundaries for him. And so God is sovereign over all. And in Luke chapter 22, we read Jesus speaking to Simon Peter, and he says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you've turned back, strengthen your brothers. Jesus knew that Peter would turn back, and he interceded for him. So even in this invisible war between the Lord and Satan, God is sovereign. And you realize also, if you do not believe that God is sovereign over all things, you are essentially subscribing to a dualistic thought, that there is some power in the universe equal to that of God, that God himself cannot have control over. And so you become a dualist whether you mean to or not. Now, author and hymn writer Margaret Clarkson suffered a lot her whole life long. And yet she said this, she said that God is indeed both good and powerful, and that's one of the basic tenets of Christian belief. She's right. Yet the reality is it's not easy to believe in the doctrine of the providence of God, especially in these hard times. Preacher isn't referring to our times, but I am. Times of a pandemic. It's not easy to believe in the providence of God in a pandemic, and I understand that. He writes as he concludes the chapter, all people, believers as well as unbelievers, experience anxiety, frustration, heartache, and disappointment. Some suffer intense physical pain and catastrophic tragedies. But that which should distinguish the suffering of believers from unbelievers is the confidence that our suffering is under the control of an all-powerful and all-loving God. Our suffering has meaning and purpose in God's eternal plan, even though we can't see it. And he brings or allows to come into our lives only that which is for his glory and our good. I want to talk to Mike and Pam Lunsford now, how they've seen God work in their lives in his providence and how they've been able to trust God even when life has been challenging and difficult, even when life is hurt for them. So invite them to come on up. We've got 2 chairs for them and microphones for them there. And we'll move to our interview area of the stage and invite them on up and talk to them about their journey of trusting in the Lord. So Mike and Pam, welcome to our little studio stage here as we shift to the second half of our study. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to tell us, if you would, as we talk to the audience here in person more this week. We've doubled, I think, from last week, so don't be intimidated by the big crowd, but also we have even others watching on the screen. So as you look out to them, if you tell them maybe a little bit about you guys, how you came just first about your relationship to the church. When did you guys start attending First Baptist Church? How long have you been a part of the life of this congregation?
Well, we started at this church in 1983. 85, thank you. A long time ago. And it was due to circumstances of my job. I was transferred here, I worked here, so it was easier for us to live here and her travel than for me to travel. So we moved to Lake Wells and we sought out the church. And been here ever since.
So you were how old then? You were in your teens then?
Yes.
We were in our late 20s.
Okay. So a little bit into your adult life. So I want to ask you then, so I don't know the details of your journey with Christ and how you began to trust God initially for salvation. Can maybe each of you tell us how you did that, how you began this relationship with God that involved trusting him initially for salvation, and then we'll talk even more how that grew, your trust in him grew.
I accepted Christ at 8 years old through Vacation Bible School in Kentucky, which is where I'm from.
Okay.
But it was actually when I was 16 at youth camp, and I had heard a sermon, and I actually felt and come to the call that I needed to decide at that point, was I really going to live for Christ and what that meant it wasn't just going to church and just looking good and doing that sort of thing, but it actually meant delving deep, living ministry and that. And so I remember distinctly walking and coming to a road that forked that night, and Christ plainly spoke to me, which way are you going?
Wow.
And that's when I chose, and from that point on.
Wow, that's great.
So.
That's great. Mike, how about you?
I had a childhood that I grew up in church, and not your typical way though. My grandparents actually took me to church every Sunday from the time I was a baby. And I remember being in my grandmother's Sunday school class. I remember being in Miss Royster's class. I remember the whole thing.
Why don't you switch and use hers? Is that one working? No.
Yep. Switch one more time. That was apropos for those of you who know me. My grandparents took me to church, and my parents didn't go. But in 1967, we had a revival in our church, small church in Fort Meade. And my mom and dad at that church service, I never will forget it. Went forward. My dad was a heavy smoker, and so was my mom. And as a 9-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid at that time, I had grown up in the church, and I watched them like a hawk. I had to know if this was real. And I saw my dad wad up a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes the night he got saved and never took another one out of the pack. I watched my grandfather do the same thing. And it changed me. And a year later, November 1967 or 1966, I always sat on the right-hand side of that little shoebox right-hand church. When he gave the invitation, I got up and I went to the left altar, and I do not know why. But it felt like I weighed 150,000 pounds. And all of a sudden, after we prayed, I weighed an ounce. That's the day.
Yeah. So when you trusted him that night, the weight of your sin came off you and you felt light as a feather, huh? That's great. So you both trusted him at a pretty young age, and now you've journeyed through a number of adult years, several decades as adults with all kinds of challenges, a few decades, a couple decades, 20 years. And you've had all kinds of challenges to kind of rock your world. You've heard us tonight talking about, is God in control? Maybe circumstances that made you say, I don't know, if God is in control, why is this happening to me? Have you had those challenges to your faith in the Lord, and how have you held on to this idea of trusting in God even when life has been so difficult at times?
Well, I think, of course, the one that really that a lot of people are aware of is in 1993, I was pregnant and went to the hospital. And actually, the night before, I had a dream that there was something wrong and all this stuff. Woke up, and Mike even said, it'll be fine, we'll go, it's fine. And, of course, when our son Joseph was born, he was diagnosed immediately. I could tell when they handed him to me that he was born with Down syndrome. And when we were kind of replaying the steps, we had to go through, shock and then grief of having the so-called perfect child, and then also acceptance. And there was at least the first couple days that even how crazy thoughts come in, I laid there in the bed and I thought, am I going to be able to do this? How am I going to do this? And I even had a fleeting thought, maybe we should give him up. Maybe we should maybe there's somebody else better out there or that could handle this. I don't know what I can do. And then the reality came that one day, if I did that, I would be at a park somewhere, and this cute little Downs kid would be playing with all these other kids and would just be wonderful. And then come to find out it might have the Lunsford nose or might have something like that, and it would be mine. And then look what we would have given up. And then finally came, I think, the acceptance. We had a kind of a prayer time, and then it turned into a praise time. And Mike and I always felt that there was some type of ministry that we would be called to for something, and all of a sudden we felt like we were there. And we then went to Deacon's home that lived on our street, and we knelt and prayed that night, and we felt at that point then that that was going to be the ministry. Now, of course, we had still tears, grief ever so often, and along the road. Mm-hmm. But yet through that, we've been able to minister to families that have children or that have gone through things like that no one else could maybe relate. That, oh, I know what you're going through. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Most people don't. And with this, they open to us because we do know what they're going through for some of the battles and struggles for all kinds of things.
So one of the things you felt there, if I'm hearing you right, was kind of fear. How are we going to handle this? It was mm-hmm. the responsibility of caring for him might be greater than a child who didn't have Downs. So you're intimidated by that? Is that part of what you were dealing with?
Well, yeah, because I think we didn't know what was ahead.
Right.
We didn't know what was ahead.
Because you had Dean at that point.
That's right.
So you've been a parent, but now it's like, whoa, I've not been a parent of this type of child.
Right.
With the needs he might have. So.
And of course, part of what they give you at the hospital at that time was negative.
Oh, really?
Negative information, negative that. And so that was...
Did they try to push you toward an abortion or no?
No,
okay.
no.
That was here in Winter Haven?
Mm-hmm,
okay.
mm-hmm. In the beginning, when I did find I was pregnant, they do a blood test or whatever, and I made it clear, no matter what this test would be, we would not be doing anything. And the physician said, it's just for me to be better prepared if there is a problem. It was negative. Okay. So,
Mike, what are you thinking, feeling? How did you trust God through it all? I'm sure you were that night when you prayed and knelt and all that, but tell us maybe what happened in your heart and mind before then.
Well, it was a difficult time, and there's a lot of things going through your mind as to whether or not you're capable. And you hear people erroneously, by the way, say, well, God gives special people to special people. Huh. And I don't buy into that. I think God does put you in circumstances to minister, and I think that's what this is. It is our ministry. Like Pam said, we thought we were always going to be called into the ministry, and Pam used to say, just don't send me to Africa. And the ministry that we have is ongoing. It's life-changing for a lot of people. But yes, the doubt, and sometimes even today, certain circumstances you'll look and you'll go, a classic example, when you plan a trip, you plan for 2. As a retiree, we have to plan for 3. So everything that we do in life includes something that was totally unanticipated, and it has to it constantly changes. Not that we would change it, not one bit of it would we change, but it is an ongoing thing that you have to think through, because it does change forever. And we have to also think about the protracted down the road. We have to think, what's going to happen when we're gone? Mm-hmm. And we've been preparing for that forever. She's sitting right over there.
Oh, Dina's here. So tell me, you've been a nurse. You are a nurse. Career, fire and rescue. So you've seen a lot of other circumstances, my guess is, in your life. Maybe not directly happening to you, sometimes happening to others in rescue situations or in caring for patients. Have some of those circumstances also caused you to say, is God in control? Can I trust God with this? How have you been able maybe even to help others learn how to trust Him in their challenging circumstances as you've learned to trust God in yours throughout your life?
I think the other thing that came to mind was when Mike and Dina were involved in a wreck. And Mike broke his neck during that wreck, and I remember being in the emergency room, and he said, have they told you what's wrong? And I'm like, no, as we were taking teeth out and stuff like that. And he said, my neck is broke. And if I could relate it, it was like someone took a 2x4 and hit me right in the face, because I automatically looked at his feet. Is he moving his feet? Is he doing all that? And, and again, it was, all right, what are we going to do? How is this going to happen? And if I could, it was the strangest thing. You would have panic. You would have all of that. Through that, it was strange. It was like there was a peace. And, certainly there was some fear and things like that, but it's like, God, how are you going to get us through this? And we really felt like
So you didn't struggle with,
him.
can he get you through it? You said,
Oh, no.
how are you going to get us through this? Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you had this commitment to trust him even in that circumstance.
Yeah. Well, we had support there. We had some friends that had come to the hospital. Amazingly, there were some already in Lakeland at the time where they were taken. And they were there at the hospital within minutes. Barry came. He was there with us. Barry and David Cash even went to Orlando and stayed with me during the surgery and all of that.
But you realize some people might experience that same thing and find reason in it to turn away from God, to reject God, and say, well, if God's good, how could this happen? I can't believe in him anymore.
I think the other thing is, as the time went on, I had at that time 2 small children, and people volunteered to take care of them and all that, so I could go. I had a Sunday school class here that even gave me gas money so I could get it, because I would try to work a few hours in the morning and then head up there and stay till 9 or 10 at night and then come back. And then food that people came once he came home. And, I just don't know how people would do it without having a church home. But through it all, it was like things that would come up. Okay, God, how are we going to handle this? And somehow it would just work out. Things would happen. And that's where we grew our faith and trust. Even through the terrible situation, it would be, you come home, and maybe I'm saying too much, but you come home, I open an envelope, and the hospital put a lien on the home to get their money for the bill. I laid it down and said, okay, went on about whatever we had to do.
Wow.
And between this, and that, it was all solved with a little over a year.
And you believed it even when you got that notice that was
Yeah.
going to happen. Now,
Yeah.
now, back to these people caring for you. I'm asking you about trusting God, and you're telling me about these people caring for you. So I'm wondering, are you saying that as these people loved and cared for you and ministered to you, it actually built up your faith, enabled you to trust God in that circumstances?
And
Okay.
I saw God through them. He was there,
Wow.
his hands and feet through these people.
Wow. Do you hear that? How powerful your ministry to others in times of need like that can build their faith, can stabilize their faith, can sustain their faith. So God, through his church, strengthens one another. It's powerful, Pam. It's very powerful. Mike, how about you? Any other circumstances in work or life that you want to talk about where your trust in God was a little bit challenged? Maybe you wavered, but God steadied you and moved you on?
Well, in the field that I was in, being a paramedic for so many years, you see things that you want to erase. And but God's sovereignty, I believe I was placed as a paramedic to be a minister to other people. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but you're dealing with life and death situations. And so I was able to do the job with God's right hand there all the time. But there are defining moments in everyone's emergency career, and I used to teach this, and that people will run that call. And what that call is that will determine whether or not you're going to continue in this or you're going to get out of it. because it weighs heavy on you. I can tell you my call. I won't tell you now what my call is, but I'll tell you if you ask me what my call is. But I understand now that my call was there for me to be able to teach other people to trust. Not everybody that I dealt with or taught was a Christian, obviously not. But I was able to convey the message to people to rely on what was their instinct, and their instinct is what God's telling them, and they're in a lot of cases to do the right thing at that particular moment. And then there's another person in the room that can tell you that's what really works in the world. But if you carry this thing and you don't have God with you, and you don't understand what God is and who God is, seeing some of the things that you see every day will destroy you. And I was able to lay my head on the pillow and say, it's all yours.
So what do you think was the greatest influencer enabling you to do that?
Well, the greatest influence is obviously my relationship, because I would come home. You have to have someone that you can confide in. You have to have someone that you can talk to that understands it and not say back anything, that will listen. And this is my sounding board. And because if you don't talk about it will destroy you. And we've been down on the knees, we've been in front of the couch praying about calls that we've encountered, because some of them you just knew that in a second that person's life or that family's life has changed forever.
Yeah. So here we are in 2020 in this pandemic now, and you guys have trusted the Lord in some of the circumstances you've talked about in your home life, in your careers. Is there anything you're able to take from that, those experiences where you trusted God in certain circumstances? You said, now I'm going to trust Him in this pandemic and in any challenges you faced here more recently.
Well, the irony of that question is this is not my first rodeo. Being in the profession as long as I've been in the profession for many, many years, went through swine flu, bird flu, SARS, Ebola, other pandemics. But the one that most people don't put two and two together on is HIV. Mm-hmm. When HIV came out in the emergency field on a rescue truck, we had 3 pair of gloves. They were all sterile. They were for burn patients and babies. So that means these hands were exposed to a lot of stuff. So I had to develop a trust that I can't be afraid. Mm-hmm. And the old adage is true. You can either be prepared or panicked. You can either react or respond. React is thoughtless. Response causes planning, or is caused by planning. I live that. So through this pandemic, I've been able to take what I have lived all those years and say, preparation, not panic. Response, not reaction. And so I go through it every day, and I showed Pam earlier today. One of the things that I live on is the fact that God said that we don't live in fear. We live by faith. And I'm sure you know the trivia behind it, but the Bible, the dead center of the Bible is the 118th Psalm, the 8th verse. But you go back 2 verses, and it says, "The Lord is for me. I will not be afraid." Now, there's no comma there. It's a semicolon, which means that's 2 separate sentences. So, the Lord is for me. He's for me. I will not be afraid. So that's what I've lived by.
Yeah, it's great. It's great. Pam, anything to add on that or no? No, it's so good, huh?
Add on that.
It's so good. So then we're going to wrap up here. Any final words to folks here that have joined us tonight, thank you all for coming out for this, and we will have a prayer time here in a little bit. So those watching, if you want to join us on Wednesdays, we'll conclude each evening with a prayer time still, as we used to before the pandemic. So grateful that you all are here to join us for prayer. But I wanted to give you a chance to say some final words of advice to those watching and to those present about trusting God in their lives. What would you tell them? Bottom line it.
Bottom line, that He is faithful.
Good.
He is faithful.
Yeah.
That just when you think you're at the end, either something will happen, something comes up that He provides, and that you just know it's not an earthly thing. It's directly from Him that He provides. He'll give you what you need at that moment, and sometimes you can even look back and say, wow, that's why that happened, or wow, that's what that was for. Just trust that that time will come somewhere down the line. Maybe not always on this earth, but that He is faithful to provide.
Mike, anything to add?
No, that's pretty much the way I feel too.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for joining us for this study of trusting God even when life hurts. Thanks to our guide, Jerry Bridges, for taking us through, and thanks to Mike and Pam Lunsford for being our special guest interviewees. So join us next week as we continue our study of trusting God even when life hurts.